My best friend was using my romantic stories for his fiction podcast without telling me. I found out when my ex called me furious. What happened when I confronted him revealed something I did not expect to find in 15 years of friendship. There are people in your life who are the place where you bring everything. Not because you have to, but because over time that place built itself, and now it exists, and it is the best place you have for the things that do not know how to go anywhere else. Sebastian was that place for me. 15 years. Since university. The friend you could call at 11 at night to tell him the date had gone terribly, and he would listen with the exact mix of genuine empathy and precise humor that made everything seem more manageable. The one who knew the names of all the men I had dated in 15 years. The details of every story. The things I had said in those stories that were the most revealing about who I was in the intimacy of a relationship. And he had spent 2 seasons turning them into episodes. Without telling me anything. My name is Valentina. I am 36 years old. I am an art director at an advertising agency, and I have spent 15 years being the best friend of Sebastian, who is 37, who is a freelance writer and screenwriter, and who 2 years ago had launched a fiction podcast that, according to the numbers he had told me about with pride, had 80,000 listeners across several Spanish-speaking countries. I had listened to the podcast. The first episodes when they came out. I had thought it was good, entertaining, with well-constructed characters. I had not recognized anything. Then I had stopped listening because work had consumed me and I had not had time. The ex who called me was named Nicholas. We had dated for 6 months 2 years ago. It had ended well to the extent those things can end well. We followed each other on social media but did not speak. His call arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with the energy of someone who has spent days processing something and has reached the point where they can no longer not call. Nicholas told me he had been listening to a podcast someone had recommended, that it was called Valentina in Transit. I was left with the phone in my hand. I asked him whether he had said Valentina in Transit. He said yes, that it was a fiction podcast about a woman called Vale who worked in advertising and who had a series of romantic relationships that did not go anywhere. That in season 2, there was a character called Nico, who was an architect, who had dated Vale for 6 months, and that the description of that relationship, the episodes, the conversations, the specific moments described, were sufficiently precise that Nicholas had recognized not only himself, but also me. I told Nicholas to send me the link. I hung up. I opened the podcast. I put on my headphones. And I started listening from episode 1 of season 1. It took me 4 hours to listen to the first 6 episodes. 4 hours of listening to my life. Not literally. The names were different. The city was a composite version. The work was similar, but not identical. But the characters, the situations, the things Vale said, the ways Vale processed her relationships, the specific details that make a story feel real and not generic. Those details were mine. They were conversations I had had with Sebastian, words I had used, ways of seeing things that were mine in a way that are not anyone else's because they're the result of how I specifically think and feel. And they were in a podcast with 80,000 listeners. I stopped listening at episode 7, not because I did not want to keep going, but because continuing at that moment was not going to give me anything additional I did not already have. I had what I needed, which was enough to have the conversation that was coming. I called Sebastian. I told him I needed to see him. That night, he asked whether I was okay. I told him not exactly. We met at his apartment. When he opened the door and saw my face, he understood before I said anything. He did not say hello. He said my name, in the way someone says it when they know. I asked him whether the podcast was called Valentina in Transit. He told me yes. I asked whether Vale was me. He took a while. He told me Vale was a character. I told him I was going to ask the question a different way. I asked whether Vale's stories came from the conversations I had told him about my relationships. This time he did not take a while. He told me yes. What Sebastian told me over the following hour, I am going to recount with the honesty it deserves, even though some parts are difficult to say. He told me he had started the podcast 2 years ago with the idea of writing about romantic relationships from a contemporary feminine perspective, that he had had difficulty building Vale's voice in a way that felt real, that at some point he had started borrowing things from my conversations because they were exactly the kind of voice he was looking for, that at first they had been small details, That over time, the small details had become the backbone of Vale as a character. That when the podcast had started to grow and have listeners, he had felt that what he had was too good to change. That he had thought about telling me on multiple occasions. That each time he had found a reason not to do it yet. That somewhere he had rationalized that I would have seen it as a compliment. I asked him whether he had really believed that. He looked down. He told me not entirely. That somewhere he had known that if he told me, I might ask him to stop. And that he had not wanted to stop. That honesty at the end was the part that cost me most to process. Because until that moment, I had had something to hold on to, the possibility that it was naivety. That he had genuinely not calculated the impact. But no, he had calculated it, and had chosen anyway. I told Sebastian several things. The first, that the podcast had to come down from all platforms, not in negotiation, as a condition for the next conversation to be able to exist. Sebastian said yes immediately, without negotiating. The second, that what he had done had consequences for real people beyond me. That Nicholas had called me furious. That he was a person who had had the bad luck of dating me during a period when Sebastian had decided that our relationship was material. That Nicholas had not given me permission to tell his story to anyone. That I had not given it either. That 80,000 people had listened to versions of our conversations and our relationships without either of us having chosen that. The third, that I needed to understand something and wanted him to answer me honestly. Whether at any point in the 2 years this had lasted, he had thought about how I would feel if I found out. Sebastian took a while. He told me yes, that there had been moments, that he had silenced them because the project mattered more to him than that discomfort. That answer was the most honest and most difficult of the entire conversation. I left Sebastian's apartment that night, not knowing what was going to happen with our friendship. Not because I had decided to end it, but because what I had discovered required time to process before I could know what I wanted. The podcast was taken down the following day. Sebastian sent me screenshots from each platform. I called Nicholas to tell him what had happened and to apologize even though the decision had not been mine. Nicholas was understanding in a way I had not expected. He told me what had bothered him most was not knowing. That knowing what had happened was in itself part of the resolution. That mattered. The relationship with Sebastian in the months that followed was the most difficult to navigate of the 15 years we have been friends. Not because there was open war, but because something in the dynamic between us had changed in a way that required being named before it could be rebuilt in some way. What we named, over time and through conversations that were sometimes very difficult, was this. Sebastian had used our friendship as material for 2 years because somewhere he had learned that my stories, my way of seeing the world belonged to him in a way that was not exactly true. That our closeness had produced in him a confusion between what was mine and what was shared, and that confusion was not innocent because he had known at some point that it was not and had chosen not to correct it. That is what we are still processing. We are still friends. Not with the same dynamic as before, with a dynamic that has limits that did not exist before because they had not been necessary. There are things I no longer tell Sebastian in the same way. Not because I do not trust him, but because what happened showed me that trust requires it to be matched with care for what is confided. And that care had not been present in the way I had assumed it was. That is also something I'm still processing. What I want to take from his story has 2 parts. The first is for those who believe in the absolute goodness of creative intentions. Using the lives of the people around you as material for your creative work requires their consent when that life is recognizable. It does not matter how much talent you have. It does not matter how much you respect the material. It does not matter how much you believe what you are doing is a tribute to that person. If the story is recognizable to the people who lived it and you do not have their permission, what you have is a problem. Not an art project. The second part is for whoever recognizes themselves in Valentina's position. When a person you trust uses what you share with them, without your permission, the betrayal is not only that they used the information. It is that during the time it lasted, they built with you an intimacy that was partly false because it had a function you did not know about. That is the hardest thing to process. Not what they did with your stories, but what that says about the conversations you thought were just between the two of you. If this story reached you, comment, Do you believe there's a line between being inspired by real life to create and using someone's life without their permission, or is that line always clear? Like if you believe consent is necessary when creative material is specific enough to be recognizable to the people who lived it. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who is creative and who might need to reflect on where that line is in their own work. Reflection to take with you. The intimacy you build with someone gives you access to parts of them that are not available to the world. That access is a privilege, not a resource. And the difference between treating it as a privilege or as a resource is exactly the difference between a real friendship and a relationship where one person extracts and the other gives without knowing they are giving.